The memory didn't knock. It simply occupied the room, heavy and uninvited like the scent of ozone before a storm. At 11:47 p.m., Sebastian Cole sat motionless at his desk while the Manhattan skyline bled a neon fever through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him. 3 open contracts stared back from the monitor, their legal jargon blurring into a gray haze he hadn't processed in 20 minutes. His phone lay face down, a black slab of silence, and the scotch in his glass remained untouched, the ice cubes sweating until they drowned in their own amber sea. He'd been staring into the middle distance for a while, slipping back into the habit he'd sworn he'd broken months ago. He was thinking about her. It had been 1 year and 3 months since Natalie Whitmore walked out of his apartment with a single suitcase, and the terrifying grace of someone who had already finished mourning. Her shoulders had been set straight, her chin high, and her face remained as dry as a desert. He remembered feeling a flicker of offense at that, a bruised ego demanding the tribute of her collapse. He'd expected devastation, or perhaps the jagged edges of a plea, some visible proof that their history carried a weight she couldn't possibly carry alone. Instead, she'd pinned him with those blue-gray eyes, cool and inscrutable as a mountain lake hiding a sudden drop-off, and offered a 2-syllable eulogy. "Okay, Sebastian." That was the end of it. No theatrics, no desperate negotiations, no jagged please. Just a simple word that somehow ignited everything they'd built and watched it turn to ash with clinical efficiency. In those first hollow weeks, he'd convinced himself her dignity was a mask, a tactical retreat designed to make him crawl back so she could reclaim the high ground. He'd actually smiled at the thought, a sharp, cynical twist of the lips as he admired the move. Classic Natalie, he'd thought, always 3 moves ahead. He promised himself he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a surrender. But the silence that followed wasn't a tactic. It was a vacuum. She never called, she never texted, and she never darkened the door of the office again. By the time he finally swallowed his pride to reach out, HR had already scrubbed her from the books. She'd filed her resignation the very night she left his apartment, cutting her ties before the elevator had even reached the lobby. The silence that followed was the kind that grew teeth the longer it lasted. It filled the hallway. It sat in her empty chair and it echoed in the break room. Eventually, her desk was claimed by a man named Trevor who laughed with a jarring, nasal honk and filled the air with the sharp, oily scent of microwaved fish. Her parking spot sat vacant for 3 weeks, a gray rectangle of nothingness, before the building reassigned it. Her name faded from the directory, as if it had been written in disappearing ink. Sebastian Cole. The man who had severed a 2-year engagement because he felt suffocated, because he claimed he needed air, discovered the exquisite irony of his choice. The void she left behind was more stifling than her presence had ever been, a thin, oxygenless atmosphere that left him perpetually lightheaded. He picked up his phone, stared at the dead screen, and set it back down. Then he picked it up again. He wasn't sure if it was boredom or the specific midnight restlessness that comes from being alone with a conscience for too long, but he opened Instagram. He scrolled past the digital noise, oversaturated sunsets in Santorini and the forced smiles of colleagues' birthday parties, and then his thumb froze. The account name was a phantom he'd hunted so often the algorithm had stopped suggesting it, Natalie Whitmore. She'd always been a ghost on social media, her profile a dormant archive of a life she kept private, until tonight. The post was a triptych of a new life. The first photo, a pair of tiny white sneakers, no bigger than a heartbeat, resting on a weathered park bench. The second, a soft focus shot of palm trees swaying against the silhouette of a fairy tale castle. Florida, Disney World. The third photo made his lungs seize. Natalie. Her hair was longer, spilling over her shoulders in the humid Florida heat. She was laughing, a raw, unscripted expression that carved deep, beautiful lines around her eyes, and cradled in her arms was a child, a small, round-faced, undeniable baby. Sebastian sat paralyzed, the ambient hum of the office ventilation suddenly sounding like a roar in his ears. The caption was a knife. First trip. She slept through the parade and loved every second. He pinched the screen, zooming in until the pixels broke. The infant had Natalie's nose and that same determined set to her mouth, topped with wisps of dark hair. But the eyes, even through the digital grain and the glare of a Florida sun, were a piercing, unmistakable green. His eyes. His hand was visibly shaking when he finally forced himself to set the phone down. The tremor started in his fingertips and worked its way into his chest. He didn't let the thought "that's my daughter" take root yet. He built a wall against it with a dozen logical explanations. A friend's child. A niece. A life she'd started the moment she stepped out of his door. But those green eyes remained burned into his retinas. He opened his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys with a desperate, frantic energy. Miami, Orlando, Jacksonville. He typed and deleted, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. The scotch remained forgotten, the ice now nothing more than a thin skin of water atop the glass. At 1:22 a.m., Sebastian Cole booked the first flight to Orlando. He lied to himself one last time, whispering into the empty, expensive office that he was just going to find her. Just to talk. But as he closed the laptop, the click of the lid sounded like a trap snapping shut. Natalie Whitmore's apartment in Winter Park was a sanctuary, built from the wreckage of a former life. It was the smallest place she'd ever lived, yet it was the only home that didn't feel like a borrowed stage. Technically, it was a one-bedroom, though the sleeping quarters were little more than a glorified alcove. Natalie had solved the spatial puzzle with a quiet, maternal defiance. She transformed the living room into her entire world and surrendered the bedroom to Ava. The walls were a soft, buttery yellow that caught the morning sun like a prayer. Inside, a second-hand crib she'd spent 3 days repainting stood beneath a mobile of paper stars. She had folded each one herself during the final, swollen month of pregnancy, her fingers moving in the dark to distract her mind from the vast, terrifying blankness of the future. She had landed here 2 months before the due date, during that strange, suspended animation between fleeing New York and deciding what staying actually meant. She'd spent weeks drifting through the South, a loose, aimless wandering she'd always promised herself she'd do someday, back when her life was a high-gloss prison of corporate deadlines and Sebastian's looming shadow. The clarity had arrived in Savannah. She was sitting outside a cafe, watching the steam rise from a cup of tea, when the math finally settled in her bones. 3 months pregnant, no job, no safety net, and a man who, according to the digital vultures of the Manhattan social scene, was already filling the empty space beside him with expensive distractions. She hadn't shattered. She simply pressed her hand flat against the slight curve of her stomach, feeling the faint, rhythmic pulse of a life that didn't know it was a secret. She didn't feel like a heroine in a movie. She just felt a cold, hard internal shift. "I am going to be okay," she told herself. It wasn't a hope. It was a mandate. She found remote consulting work within 3 weeks. Turns out the world still needed systems analysts, even those hiding in the humid heart of Florida with a growing belly. She built a life out of small, sacred rhythms, morning walks with the stroller, the wheels clacking rhythmically against the sun-baked pavement, work during nap times, and quiet evenings on a balcony that smelled of the neighbor's orange tree and the damp promise of evening rain. Ava had arrived at 35 weeks, breathless, tiny, and heart-wrenchingly quiet for those first few minutes. Natalie had been alone in the sterile white glare of the delivery room, her only anchor a nurse named Diane who held her hand with a grip that said, "I've got you," without uttering a word. Those 8 days in the NICU were a blur of 15-minute increments, Natalie standing over the plastic incubator as if she could breathe for her daughter by sheer force of will. But Ava stayed. She fought for her place in the world, and Natalie loved her with a ferocity that felt like a total molecular restructuring. The woman she had been in New York, the one who wore designer heels and bit her tongue to keep the peace, now felt like a rough draft of a person she no longer recognized. By 10 months, Ava was no longer just a baby. She was a person. She was old enough to reach for what she wanted with chubby, insistent fingers, old enough to protest with a lung capacity that surprised the neighbors, and old enough to break into a toothless grin that made the last year of struggle feel like a bargain. And she had Sebastian's eyes. Natalie had seen it in the NICU, even under the harsh UV lights. dark green, slightly tilted at the corners, possessing a precocious, evaluating gaze that seemed to judge the world before accepting it. She had allowed herself to cry about it exactly once, a hot, jagged release of grief in the shower, and then she'd kissed the baby's forehead and closed that door forever. The Disney trip had been a rare crack in her armor. Her friend Maya had pushed, and for once Natalie was tired of being a ghost. She was tired of shrinking her life until it fit into a 400-square-foot studio. She wanted her daughter to see the castle. She'd posted the photos with a dangerous sense of normalcy, a small step back into a world she'd abandoned. She hadn't considered the ghost that still haunted her digital periphery. That was her first mistake. Her phone buzzed 3 times that night, the vibrations drilling into the wooden coffee table like a warning siren. It was a notification from an account she'd blocked a lifetime ago. An algorithmic glitch or a forgotten update had resurrected the link. Sebastian, Cole has started following you. The name on the screen felt like a physical weight, a cold hand pressing against her throat. Natalie sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of the courtyard trees. She told herself she was prepared. She told herself she was over him. But as she sat there, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch and darken, and she realized she wasn't just nervous. She was absolutely terrified. Sebastian had been in Orlando for 4 days, and the Florida humidity was starting to feel like a physical weight on his lungs. 4 days of pacing through manicured neighborhoods near the Disney gates, showing Natalie's photo to distracted cafe owners and bored hotel staff with the jittery, unhinged energy of a man who had traded his dignity for a ghost story. He'd even consulted a private investigator, a man with a leathery face and the weary patience of a saint, who had eventually pointed out that finding someone who didn't want to be found required more than a single GPS tag and a prayer. 6 times he'd sat on the edge of his hotel bed with the airline app open, his thumb hovering over the confirm button for a flight back to the life that no longer fit him. He refreshed her Instagram every hour, a digital tick that yielded nothing but the same 3 photos. No new posts, no tagged locations, no fleeting stories. She had retreated into that familiar, impenetrable silence, that terrifying talent she had for simply ceasing to exist the moment she decided she was done. On the 5th day, the sun rose with a bruised, purple light that pushed him out of bed before his alarm. For the first time in his professional life, Sebastian Cole drove without a destination. He was a man of quarterly objectives and ruthless schedules, but Orlando felt like a labyrinth designed to mock him. He drifted aimlessly until he found himself at a park he'd bypassed twice before, a sprawling green expanse where ancient oak trees dripped with Spanish moss like weeping gray lace. He parked the car, the engine cooling with a rhythmic metallic ticking, and collapsed onto a bench near the water's edge. He wasn't crying. He was merely existing in that jagged space where men who have spent 37 years fleeing from emotion finally run out of road. His jaw was a locked vice, his eyes were scorched dry, and his hands sat heavy and useless in his lap. It was an exhaustion that went deeper than bone, a fatigue of the soul that sleep couldn't touch. After 20 minutes of staring at the ripples on the lake, he leaned forward and buried his face in his palms. The silence of the park pressed in on him, amplified by the distant, joyful screams of children he didn't know. He'd lost her. The realization finally took root, sharp and cold as a winter frost. Whatever closure he'd been hunting, some cinematic resolution where she looked at him with something other than pity, was a fantasy. She had built a fortress here. She had moved on, leaving him behind in a world that felt suddenly violently empty. She moved on, he thought with a jagged inward twist, and you couldn't even manage to buy the right flight home. He let out a short, humorless bark of a laugh, a dry, splintering sound that sent a nearby grackle fluttering into the trees. Then he straightened his spine, he lifted his head to catch his breath, and the world stopped turning. There are moments that fracture time into a permanent before and after. Moments that sear themselves into the mind with the hyper-vivid saturation of a fever dream, where the air grows thick, the light shifts to gold, and every heartbeat feels like a drum in an empty room. She was 30 feet away. Natalie was sitting cross-legged on a patterned blanket in the dappled shade of a massive oak. She wore a soft yellow sundress, her hair falling in loose chestnut waves over her bare shoulders, her feet tucked into the grass. She was mid-laugh, her face illuminated by a joy he hadn't seen in years, and beside her, propped against a velvet cushion and a scattered constellation of Cheerios, was the baby. The child was looking directly at him. Sebastian didn't move. He wasn't sure his heart was still beating. The entire park, the kite flyers, the joggers, the ordinary Saturday morning hum of the universe, faded into a muffled, underwater roar. Ava blinked at him. Those enormous green eyes, his eyes mirrored in a face of pure innocence, met his across the grass. Sebastian's chest didn't just ache, it cracked wide open, a slow-motion shattering of every wall he'd ever built to keep the world out. Natalie looked up then, her gaze following the baby's. The laughter died on her face, replaced by a palpable, freezing shock that seemed to drain the very color from the air around her. For an eternal second, neither of them moved. The 30 feet of sunlit grass between them felt like a chasm, filled with a year's worth of unsaid words and broken promises, a distance that was impossible to cross and yet unbearable to maintain. She started to scramble to her feet, her movements frantic and protective as she reached for the child. "Don't run." His voice tore out of his throat, rough and ragged as if he'd been screaming in his sleep. "Not again, Natalie, please." She froze, one hand hovering over the baby's stroller, her breath hitching in the quiet morning air. Natalie Whitmore had rehearsed this haunting 1,000 times, in the raw, sleepless wreckage of the early months, through the stifling Florida heat, the sterile hum of the NICU, and the terrifying realization that she was now an entire universe to a tiny, fragile son. She had scripted this encounter. She'd practiced her lines while folding tiny onesies and staring at the moon. She had debated whether she would meet him with icy composure, a scorched earth fury, or the most devastating weapon of all. A quiet, hollow indifference that signaled he no longer occupied even a corner of her mind. But she had always imagined she would have a head start. She hadn't prepared for the ambush of a Saturday morning. She scooped Ava up. It wasn't a defensive move, or so she lied to herself. It was simply the instinct of a mother whose world had suddenly become unmanageable. Pressing her daughter against her chest, feeling the warm, steady thrum of the baby's heartbeat against her own racing pulse, she stood and looked at Sebastian Cole for the first time in 15 months. He looked like a shadow of the man she'd left. The sight of him caught her off guard. The Sebastian she knew was a masterpiece of curated control, expensive, polished, and perpetually unruffled. But the man standing 20 feet away was frayed at the edges, wearing the gray, sunken exhaustion of a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He had 2 days of uneven stubble and dark circles that looked like bruises against his pale skin. A small, inconvenient part of her heart flinched at the sight. It was a phantom limb of an old affection, twitching with a memory she thought she'd buried. She choked that feeling instantly. "How did you find me?" Her voice was a steady, cold blade. She was profoundly grateful it didn't shake. "Your post." He took a single step forward, hesitant, as if he were walking on thin ice that might crack at the slightest sound. Natalie didn't retreat. She refused to give him the satisfaction of her fear, but her arms tightened around Ava, a silent, physical barricade. "The Disney photos. I've been in this city for 5 days, Natalie." 5 days. She let the words hang in the humid air, letting the absurdity of it sink in. "You've been wandering around Orlando for 5 days because of a single Instagram post. I've been looking for you for over a year based on nothing at all." He spoke with a blunt, factual simplicity, offering no bid for her sympathy. It was the tone of a man admitting a debt he knew he could never repay. "A photo with a location was more than I've had in 14 months. Ava broke the tension with a soft, curious gurgle. She reached out, her small hand grasping at the air toward the bright, polished buttons on Sebastian's shirt, oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting between the adults. He looked at the child. Something broke across his face. An unguarded, massive wave of emotion that he tried to pull back behind his mask, but he was a second too late. The facade didn't just slip. It disintegrated, leaving him looking raw and dangerously exposed. Natalie knew the truth with a searing clarity. She didn't owe him a single breath. Not a confession, not an explanation, and certainly not the grace of letting him stand in her sunshine to pretend that simply showing up was an act of redemption. But the complication lay in the silence, in the way her own body remembered his scent and the way the baby's eyes were a perfect, cruel mirror of his own. "You should go, Sebastian," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "I'm not going." "Sebastian, I'm not going anywhere." He said it quietly, more like a vow to himself than an ultimatum to her. "I've come too far. I've been—" He stopped, drawing a sharp breath to reset his composure. "Please, just 10 minutes. Just talk to me. We have nothing to discuss. You made your position exceptionally clear when I left. I was wrong." The admission sounded like it cost him every ounce of pride he had left. It was the sound of a man finally surrendering a war he'd already lost. "I know that doesn't fix a damn thing. I know it's too late for apologies to matter. But I was wrong, and I've spent every waking second since you walked out knowing it." Ava reached for him again, her tiny fingers splayed in an invitation she didn't understand. Sebastian's eyes dropped to the girl, really looking at her this time, abandoning the careful, panicked avoidance he'd been maintaining. He tracked the dark wisps of hair, the stubborn set of the jaw, and finally the piercing green of her eyes. His eyes staring back at him from a future he hadn't known existed. His entire body went unnervingly still. "Natalie." His voice had shifted. It was lower now, vibrating with a sudden, terrifying realization. How old is she? Natalie's heart was drumming a rhythm she had no name for, a mix of terror and a strange, soaring justice. 10 months, she said. She watched him do the math, watching the realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless in the heat of the Florida morning. He did it in the silence, a quiet, internal collapse. Natalie could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the frantic, undeniable arithmetic he'd been skirting since the moment he first saw that grainy Instagram photo. As long as he didn't possess the exact numbers, the truth was still a ghost he could choose not to believe in. But now, the math was a firing squad. 1 year and 3 months since she walked out. A 10-month-old child in her arms. He finally tore his gaze away from Ava, looking up at Natalie with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in the span of a heartbeat. Is she mine? The park refused to acknowledge the wreckage. Somewhere behind them, a toddler shrieked with delight, and a golden retriever barked at its own reflection in the lake. The world had no interest in pausing for the shattering of a man's reality. Natalie held his gaze, her spine a rigid line of defiance. She thought of the 1,000 speeches she'd rehearsed in the dark, the articulate, scathing explanations designed to make her appear untouchable, a fortress of maternal strength that his guilt couldn't scale. She had planned to be a queen delivering a sentence, but when the moment arrived, the words felt like ash. She said nothing at all. She simply watched him, her silence stretching out between them like a physical barrier, heavy and suffocating as the Florida humidity. In that wordless space, the answer didn't need to be spoken. It was written in the tilt of the baby's head and the haunting familiarity of her stare. We have to stop here for a moment, because what follows isn't a cinematic explosion or a tearful confession. It is something far more devastating. The sound of a man realizing the exact shape of the hole he carved into his own life, while the evidence of his loss reaches out to touch his skin. Sebastian didn't collapse. He simply subsided. His legs seemed to make a unilateral decision to give up, and he found himself sitting on the grass, 3 feet from the edge of her picnic blanket. He sat cross-legged, elbows resting on his knees, hands hanging limp. The posture of a man who had finally stopped running and found himself at a dead end. He just looked at Ava. The baby returned his stare with the absolute, terrifying curiosity of the innocent. She reached for him again, that relentless, optimistic reaching of a child who hasn't yet learned that the world can be sharp. This time, he was close enough. Her tiny, inquisitive fingers grazed the underside of his wrist, a touch so light it should have been nothing. But it hit him with the force of an electric shock. He didn't pull away. He didn't move at all. He barely seemed to breathe. Natalie felt a sudden, sharp constriction in her throat, a knot of old grief and new anger tightening until it hurt. She was early, she heard herself say. The words weren't planned. They were a leak in her hull. 35 weeks. She spent 8 days in the NICU. She swallowed hard, the memory of the fluorescent lights and the beeping monitors rising up to choke her. I was alone, Sebastian, every minute of it. He closed his eyes, his face twisting into a mask of sudden, acute pain. I know, he whispered. It was a strange thing to say. He was only just learning the timeline, only just seeing the ghost of the struggle she'd endured. But it didn't sound like a lie. It sounded like an admission. I know what I've done. I know the price of my absence, and I know I can never pay it back. Ava's hand suddenly clamped shut, her tiny fist wrapping around his index finger. Her entire hand was barely as wide as one of his knuckles, a fragile, warm weight that anchored him to the earth. Sebastian looked down at that connection, and his expression broke. It didn't just soften, it fractured in a way Natalie had never seen in all the years she'd known him. The polished, invulnerable CEO was gone, replaced by a man looking at a miracle he didn't deserve to touch. Natalie had to look away. The sight was too much. It was the version of him she had once prayed for arriving a year too late. I need you to go, she said, her voice a ragged whisper. I'm not ready for this. You showing up like this, standing in my life as if you belong here. I know. He didn't fight her. He didn't plead. He very gently unwound his finger from Ava's grip, a slow, agonizing detachment, and forced himself to stand. He brushed the grass from his trousers with a mechanical precision, a desperate attempt to reconstruct the man he used to be before his knees hit the dirt. I know, he repeated. I'll go. He turned and walked away. He didn't look back, his stride heavy and mechanical as he disappeared into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the park. Natalie sat perfectly still until the sound of his footsteps faded into the ambient noise of the morning. Only then did she pull Ava into her lap, burying her face in the soft, milk-scented curve of the baby's neck, and let the first violent tremor of a sob shake her entire body. He returned the following morning, though not with the frantic, unannounced desperation of the park. Instead, he sent a text, a digital olive branch that shimmered on her lock screen like a ghost from a past life. Natalie had blocked his number a year ago, yet she'd unblocked it the previous night in a fit of restless, unexplained impulse. Can we talk? Somewhere public. An hour. I won't ask for more than that. Natalie stared at the words until they blurred. Nearby, Ava was navigating the complex logistics of breakfast. Mashed banana smeared across her cheeks like war paint and a small fortress of cereal circles. The baby wore a look of intense, furrowed concentration, the exact same expression Sebastian wore when he was dissecting a merger. Natalie's thumbs hovered over the glass. Coffee shop on Morse Avenue. 10 a.m. She arrived first. Habit was a cruel master. She had always been the one waiting, arriving early to every date, every dinner, every milestone. You show up for things before they're even ready for you, Nat, he used to tease. Back then, it had felt like a compliment, a tribute to her eagerness to be near him. Now it just felt like a symptom of a woman who had spent too long waiting for a man to catch up. Maya had taken Ava for the morning, leaving Natalie's arms feeling strangely light and vulnerable. Sebastian stepped through the door at 9:58. He ordered a black coffee he clearly had no intention of drinking and slid into the booth across from her. He looked at her with the brittle, aching care of a man trying to study a wild bird without making it take flight. Tell me, she said, her voice cutting through the hiss of the espresso machine. Whatever it is you came here to say. I want you to tell me first. He wrapped his hands around the ceramic mug as if seeking warmth his body couldn't produce. Why didn't you call? When you found out? Why didn't you tell me? The question hit her with the weight she'd expected, yet it still drew the air from her lungs. I was going to. She focused on a scratch in the mahogany tabletop, tracing the grain as if it were a map out of this conversation. The day I found out, I was in a motel in Savannah, a terrible hollow place that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaner. I had your number pulled up. I was ready to dial. She paused, the memory sharp and jagged in her throat, and then I opened Instagram, just a reflex, habit. She watched his expression shift, a flicker of dawning dread crossing his features. You and a woman, she continued, at a rooftop bar. The caption was some garbage about New York's most eligible CEO finding comfort after a split, and you were. She stopped, the image of him leaning into another woman's space flashing behind her eyes like a neon sign. It looked like a lot more than comfort, Sebastian. It wasn't. His voice was flat, stripped of all artifice. It was one night. 2 weeks after you walked out, I wasn't handling the silence well. She was a ghost from my past, someone I'd known long before you. I ran into her and made a catastrophic decision for all the wrong reasons. He met her gaze, his eyes dark with a sincere, shimmering regret. I hated myself before I even left the bar. There was nothing after that night. That's not the point. I know. The point is that I was sitting on a polyester bedspread in Savannah, terrified and pregnant, about to beg for my old life back. And I saw that photo. She pressed her lips together, tasting the ghost of the salt she'd cried that night. I thought, he's fine. He's already survived me. You were at a rooftop bar celebrating your freedom while I was falling apart in a parking lot. Her voice remained level, a feat of sheer practiced will. So I put the phone down, and I kept it down. Think of the isolation of that moment, the crushing weight of a secret life growing inside you, and the first signal you receive from the man who helped create it is a photograph of him laughing in the glow of a city skyline. It wasn't just a photo, it was a permission slip for her to disappear. I was looking for you, Sebastian said, the words spilling out as if they'd been dammed up for a century. Every single day, I called every contact, every old friend. I hired an investigator who turned out to be a fraud. I even drove to your mother's house in Connecticut. A ghost of a tired smile touched his lips. She told me, with terrifying politeness, that she didn't know where you were, and that if she did, she'd rather burn the house down than tell me. Natalie felt a faint, bitter warmth at the thought of her mother's ferocity. I made a mistake, Natalie, ending us. He said it without the usual polish of a corporate apology. It was raw and bleeding. I convinced myself I was suffocating. I told myself I needed space and freedom. And the moment you were actually gone, I realized, with the kind of clarity that feels like a physical blow, that what I'd called suffocation was just the weight of being loved. Actual, messy, heavy love. The coffee shop hummed around them, a blur of mundane morning rituals that felt light years away from the wreckage sitting between them on the table. I looked for you every day, he whispered, for over a year. Natalie looked at him, really looked at him, past the stubble and the expensive shirt, into the hollowed-out man underneath. I hear what you're telling me, she said softly, and I believe you. She took a breath, her gaze hardening just enough to draw a line in the sand. But you don't get credit for looking for someone you chose to lose. Natalie didn't exactly map out the surrender. One moment she and Sebastian were standing on the sun-bleached sidewalk outside the coffee shop, the heavy weight of their history settling around them like dust after a collapse. The next, he was asking, his voice low and tentative, as if he were bracing for a physical blow, could I meet her? Properly? And Natalie, who possessed 100 bulletproof reasons to say, not yet, felt the air shift. Tomorrow morning, she heard herself say. 9 o'clock, don't be late. He was there at 8:50, pacing the welcome mat with the frantic precision of a man awaiting a verdict. When she opened the door, he was clutching a grease-stained paper bag from the local bakery, wearing an expression of pure, controlled terror. I didn't know what she eats, he blurted out by way of greeting. I was at a booth in the back of a diner at 7:30 this morning, Googling nutritional requirements for 10-month-olds. She eats mashed bananas and O-shaped cereal, Sebastian. I got a banana muffin, he offered, holding the bag up like a peace treaty. Is that acceptable? She'll pick the fruit out with her thumbs and launch the cake onto the floor. Great. He stared at the bag, his knuckles white against the paper. That's great. I need to be honest with you. Watching Sebastian Cole, a man who has spent a decade dismantling competitors and navigating billion-dollar shark tanks without breaking a sweat, get completely leveled by a 10-month-old in a strawberry print onesie is a specific kind of justice. It is, quite simply, the most satisfying thing you will ever witness. I'm not even slightly sorry about it. Ava was enthroned in her high chair when he entered the kitchen, looking like a tiny, sticky scientist as she systematically dismantled a pile of cereal. She looked up as the shadow of a stranger crossed the linoleum. She stared at him. He stared back, frozen in the doorway as if he'd just walked into a cathedral. Hi, he whispered. Ava weighed the greeting with a heavy, evaluating silence. Then, with a sudden, jerky motion, she held out a fistful of soggy, saliva-coated cereal toward him. Sebastian looked at Natalie. Natalie looked back, her face a mask of ironclad resolve as she fought the urge to let a smile break through. I think that's a diplomatic offering, she said. He sat at the kitchen table, lowering himself until he was eye level with the high chair tray. He accepted the damp clump of cereal with more gravity than he had ever given a boardroom presentation. Thank you, he said, his voice thick and unnervingly serious. Ava found this performance hysterical. She erupted into a full-body baby laugh, the kind of raw, unearned delight that makes the rest of the world feel gray and redundant. She laughed so hard she tipped dangerously sideways, her small hand slapping the plastic tray to steady herself. Sebastian watched her as if she were the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, because in that sun-drenched kitchen, she was the only thing that mattered. The morning unfolded with a disorienting normalcy. Sebastian cleared the breakfast plates without being prompted, his movements careful and quiet as if he were afraid of breaking the spell. He eventually ended up on the kitchen floor when Ava crawled over to investigate his leather shoes with intense, personal interest. He tried to read her a board book, doing it badly with no sense of dramatic timing. But when she kept interrupting to pat the colorful pages, he simply closed the book and began weaving a story from scratch. He held the pictures toward her, his voice dropping into a soft, melodic hum, and Ava sat in his lap as if she'd lived there her entire life. Natalie stood in the kitchen doorway, the wood of the frame pressing into her shoulder. She watched the way his large hand hovered protectively behind the baby's head. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a dangerous, glowing thing she tried to smother before it could take root. Later, once Ava had drifted off for her morning nap, a heavy silence returned to the living room. Sebastian stood by the window, looking slightly at a loss in a space that didn't belong to him. Natalie made tea, and they sat across from each other with the same careful, curated distance they had maintained in the park. She's incredible, he said, the word breathless and jagged. I know. I'm not saying that because... He stopped, shaking his head. I'm saying it as a fact. She's just incredible. I know, Natalie said again, her voice softening at the edges like a fading bruise. A silence settled between them. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't the jagged glass of the day before. I'm not going back to New York, Sebastian said suddenly. Not yet. I'd like, if you're even remotely willing, to stay here to get to know her. We can structure it however you need. Natalie wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic of her tea, her heart doing a slow, heavy roll in her chest. I'll think about it, she said. It wasn't a yes. But as she looked at the man who had once walked away from everything, the no she'd been carrying for a year felt suddenly, impossibly heavy. 2 weeks bled into a strange, tentative choreography. A rhythm had begun to take root, Sebastian appearing at the apartment 2 or 3 mornings a week, always operating on Natalie's strict, non-negotiable terms. He arrived with advance notice, he remained present and anchored, and he vanished the moment she signaled the visit was over. He didn't push against the boundaries, he didn't litigate the past. He simply showed up, his presence a quiet, persistent hum in the background of her new life. He'd signed a long-term lease on an apartment in Winter Park. Natalie meticulously curated her expressions, pretending the knowledge of his permanence didn't send a low-frequency tremor through her chest. On a Tuesday evening, once the brutal Florida heat had finally softened into a humid lavender dusk, they found themselves on her small balcony. It was an accident of proximity. Ava was finally asleep, and Natalie had stepped out for air only to find him still there, lingering from the afternoon. To send him home felt suddenly, sharply rude. They sat in the quiet, the air smelling of damp earth and distant jasmine, and he finally spoke about the woman in the photo. Her name was Claire, he said. He was staring out at the darkened courtyard, his profile etched in sharp relief against the amber glow of the streetlights. We dated briefly years ago. It was nothing substantial. I ran into her at a function 2 weeks after you left, and I was... He cut himself off, his jaw tightening. I was not in a good place. I wasn't sleeping. I was haunted, Natalie. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a vibration that never came, waiting for you to tell me it was all a mistake. And you didn't. So you decided to... Made an idiotic decision for the worst possible reason. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and hollowed out by the memory. I think on some level I believe that if I performed the role of a man who had moved on, I would eventually become him. Like faking confidence until it becomes real. I thought I could outrun the grief. That isn't how it works, she whispered. You can't outrun a ghost. No. He held her gaze, his voice dropping to a low, bruised register. I know that now. There is a specific jagged pain in hearing someone explain their lowest moment. When the villain of your story starts sounding like a flawed, breaking human, it doesn't undo the damage, but it complicates the anger. It's much easier to hate a monster than it is to forgive a man who was simply too afraid to be real. And sometimes, that realization is the hardest thing to carry. I didn't know you were struggling, Natalie said, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the trees. I've spent my whole life perfecting the mask. You always did. She looked away toward the silhouette of the orange tree. That was the rod at the center of us, wasn't it? You were so closed. Even when we were engaged, even when we were at our best, I never truly knew what was happening behind your eyes. I'd ask and you'd give me that fine, that polished corporate fine that felt like a locked door. I used to wonder if you'd just as soon be alone. I thought I would. The confession came out weighted with a heavy, leaden honesty. I'd been alone so long, Natalie. I was efficient at it. I was successful at it. And then you were just there, every single day, and I didn't know how to handle the fact that I'd started to need you. I panicked. I burned the bridge because I was terrified of how much I wanted to stay on the other side. The silence that followed was heavy, pulsing with the ghosts of the year they'd lost. You broke me, Natalie said. She didn't say it with heat. She said it with a devastating factual quiet. I need you to understand that. I didn't have a public meltdown. I didn't shatter in a way people could see, but you broke something vital. She looked down at her hands, her fingers interlacing as if to hold herself together. I was 3 months pregnant when you told me you needed freedom. My body was already building a life while you were dismantling ours. And then I found out, and I was alone in a strange city, and I had to choose between being a mother in a vacuum or crawling back to a man who was already laughing at a rooftop bar. She looked up, her eyes shimmering with an old, cold fire. I needed you most in the exact moment you made yourself unreachable. Sebastian didn't flinch, he didn't look away. I know, he said. That's it? That's all you have? What else is there? He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, his entire posture a plea. It's the truth, every word of it. I can apologize every morning for the rest of my life and it won't unbreak what I shattered. I know that. What I'm asking, and I know I have no right to even speak the words, is whether there is a version of this world where I get to be different. where I get to try again. The courtyard below was still. The orange tree sighed in the evening breeze, dropping a single overripe fruit onto the grass with a muffled thud. I don't know, Natalie said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a welcome. But it was the first time she hadn't said no. And in the quiet of the Florida night, it felt like the first breath of air after a long time underwater. She found them on a Saturday afternoon, bathed in the thick, honeyed light of a Florida weekend, and for a moment, the air in the hallway felt too thin to breathe. Natalie had escaped to the shower, a desperate 20-minute sanctuary after a morning of Ava's teething-induced storms. Sebastian had arrived mid-chaos, wordlessly rolling up his sleeves and stepping into the fray. When she emerged, the apartment was held in a fragile, crystalline silence. She almost called out, her voice hovering at the back of her throat, before she drifted into the living room. Sebastian was anchored in the armchair. Her chair, the oversized second-hand piece she'd lovingly reupholstered with her own hands. Ava was curled against the broad expanse of his chest like a small, snoring comma, her damp heat soaking through his expensive cotton shirt. His large hand rested on her back, moving in slow, rhythmic circles, while his head leaned toward her, eyes closed in a rare, unguarded surrender. They looked specific. There was a visible, invisible architecture between them, a shared DNA that seemed to hum in the quiet room, a biological recognition that bypassed the mind entirely. Natalie stood in the shadows of the hallway for a long time, her damp hair dripping onto her shoulders, her heart a heavy, erratic pendulum. I need to be very clear with you. This wasn't a scene from a romance novel. It wasn't about Natalie and Sebastian, or the flickering embers of what they used to be. It was the visceral sight of a man discovering his daughter in the quiet, and a woman watching her fiercely guarded solitude expand to hold a ghost she hadn't expected to return. It was devastating, not because of what was said, but because of the profound, heavy beauty of what was finally present. In the weeks that followed, the story of his year came out in jagged, honest fragments. He spoke of the first month after she'd vanished, the hollow arrogance of convincing himself he'd made the right choice. He'd chased freedom, only to find it felt like an exile. He described the specific, corrosive misery of being right about the small, logistical things while being catastrophically, soul-crushingly wrong about the only thing that mattered. He told her of the dead ends, the calls to mutual friends who offered the same rehearsed, icy neutrality. We don't know where she is. Delivered with the razor-edged politeness of people who had seen his sins and chosen a side. I called your mother 3 times, he confessed one evening. They were sitting on the floor, their knees nearly touching as they watched Ava attempt to walk. 3 determined, shaky steps followed by a spectacular crash, only for her to pull herself back up with the relentless, terrifying resolve of someone who hadn't yet learned that falling was a reason to stop. The 3rd time, she told me, Sebastian, she doesn't want to be found. That should tell you everything you need to know about the man you've been. And then she hung up. Good for my mother, Natalie murmured, a small, sharp spark of pride warming her chest. I agreed with her even then. He reached out, catching Ava just as she pitched forward, his hands steady and sure as he set her back on her feet. But knowing I deserved the silence didn't make me stop looking for the sound of your voice. Love is a deceptive thing. Its true scale is often only revealed in its absence. When it's present, you're too close to the flame to see the hearth. It's only when the room goes cold and the shadows stretch long that you understand the exact agonizing shape of what you've lost. They grew close during those weeks. A careful, watchful proximity, like 2 travelers testing the integrity of thin ice with every step. Some evenings stretched into unplanned dinners, falling into the comfortable, dangerous grooves of 2 people who had always known the secret language of a shared room. There were mornings when Natalie found herself listening for the specific weight of his knock, before she'd even allowed herself to admit she was waiting for it. She caught him watching her sometimes, not with the predatory intensity of his old life, but with a quiet, scholarly attention, as if he were trying to memorize the way the light caught the stray hairs at her temple. One night, after Ava had surrendered to sleep and the dishes were finished, the air in the small kitchen grew heavy. There was no pragmatic reason for him to stay, yet he lingered by the counter. When Natalie turned around from the cupboard, the space between them had vanished, collapsed by a sudden magnetic gravity. She looked up. He looked down, his gaze searching her face with a desperate, silent hunger. The distance, already microscopic, seemed to contract into nothing. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and something fundamentally Sebastian, filled her senses until her head spun. She forced herself to step back, the movement sharp and jagged as a broken bone. "You should go," she whispered. It wasn't an order, it was a plea for safety. He nodded once, a slow, somber acknowledgement. He picked up his jacket, his fingers lingering on the fabric for a fraction of a second, and then he was gone. Neither of them spoke of the ghost of the kiss that had almost happened, but the silence it left behind was the loudest thing in the apartment. The retreat began 3 days later, executed with the quiet, surgical precision that had always been her trademark. Natalie wasn't a woman of grand, cinematic gestures. She didn't slam doors or offer tearful ultimatums. Instead, she simply became a ghost in her own home. The morning windows of availability began to shrink. The visits grew shorter, punctuated by a sudden influx of fussy mornings and heavy deadlines. Every excuse was technically a fact, and every single one was a lie. The truth was far simpler. She was terrified. For 15 months, she had laid the bricks of a new existence, a life, a self, a daily reality that functioned perfectly without his gravity. She had been proud of that woman. She had finally scrubbed her skin clean of the particular aching helplessness that comes from loving a man who treats intimacy like a cage. But now, he was a permanent fixture on her living room floor, catching Ava mid-tumble with practiced ease. He was looking at her across the kitchen table with those emerald eyes that still held the power to rewrite her pulse, and she could feel the bedrock of her independence beginning to liquefy. You cannot fault a person for flinching when the hand that once broke them reaches out to touch them again. Scar tissue isn't a sign of weakness. It's a topographical map of survival. It is the body's way of remembering exactly what happened the last time it let its guard down. Sebastian noticed the shift. He had always possessed the observational prowess of a predator, that needle-sharp focus he applied to everything he deemed valuable. He felt the temperature in the room drop, and for 4 days he endured the frost in silence. Then, with the calculated caution of a man disarming a bomb, he spoke. "Are you withdrawing on purpose, Natalie?" "I'm just busy, Sebastian. Life doesn't stop because you're in town." "Natalie." He said her name with a low, vibrating weight that forced her to look up. She stared into the dark depths of her coffee cup, tracing the steam as it vanished into the humid air. "I don't know what you want from me. I think I've been incredibly clear about what I want. You want a second chance?" She finally met his gaze, her expression a shield of polished glass. "But the woman you were engaged to is dead. You're chasing a memory, and you have no idea who I've become in the year you were gone. You know the girl who stayed quiet. You don't know the woman who survived." She paused, her voice harshened by a sudden jagged edge. "And I don't know you, either, not the real you." "Then let me show you. Give me the time to prove it." "And what happens when the novelty wears off?" she challenged, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What happens when you wake up and decide, all over again, that we're suffocating you? That the weight of being needed is too much for a man who likes his freedom?" He opened his mouth to offer a polished rebuttal, then closed it. The silence that followed was an admission. It was the only honest question that mattered, and the fact that he didn't have a scripted answer confirmed her worst fears. The ghost of his old exit still stood in the corner of the room, tall and silent. That night, after the door clicked shut behind him, Natalie opened her laptop in the dark. The blue light of the screen cast a ghostly pallor over her face as she searched for flights to Seattle. Her college roommate, Priya, had been a persistent voice in her ear for months, offering a spare room, a lack of judgment, and a city where Sebastian Cole's long-term lease meant absolutely nothing. With a trembling finger, she booked 2 seats, 1 adult, 1 lap infant, for the following Thursday. She whispered to the empty room that it was just a vacation, a change of scenery. a breath of fresh air. But as she closed the laptop, the sound was as final as a tombstone settling into place. She didn't tell him she was leaving. He found out from Maya. It hadn't been a calculated betrayal, but rather the organic byproduct of a man who had spent 2 weeks showing up, being genuine, and proving, inch by grueling inch, that he was willing to do the work. Maya had watched him on the kitchen floor with Ava. She had seen the hollowed-out sincerity in his eyes that Natalie was too terrified to acknowledge. When her text arrived on Wednesday night, "Hey, did Natalie mention she's leaving Thursday?" It wasn't a leak. It was a flare sent up by someone who saw a shipwreck in progress and refused to look away. Sebastian read the message 3 times, the words blurring into a jagged neon pulse. Thursday. Tomorrow. He stood paralyzed in the center of his rented apartment, his phone a heavy weight in his palm. She's doing it again. He knew it wasn't a carbon copy of the first time. She had every right to flee, a history of hurt to justify the distance, and a daughter to protect. But the skeleton of the move was identical. She was hitting the panic button, retreating into the clouds before he could find the courage to say the words that had been rotting in his throat. He dialed her number. Voicemail. He called again, the ringing sounding like a hollow rhythmic mocking. He grabbed his keys and ran. She was at the gate when he found her. Orlando International Terminal B, Gate 34. Sebastian had sprinted from the parking garage, a genuine, lung-burning dash he hadn't attempted since high school, and arrived at the boarding area with 2 minutes to spare and no plan beyond the primal, desperate need to keep her on the ground. Natalie was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun casting her in a harsh, unforgiving silhouette. Ava was strapped to her chest in the carrier, a small, warm weight, and Natalie was staring at her boarding pass as if it were a map to a new life. She looked up at the sound of his ragged breathing and went deathly still. "No," she said, her voice a flat, exhausted line. "Just, Sebastian, this is insane. You can't just hunt me down at an airport." "I know." He was doubled over, hands on his knees, his lungs burning with the sharp metallic taste of exertion. He didn't care about the onlookers or the indignity of his sweat-soaked shirt. "I know it's insane. I know I have no right to be here. I know you can walk through that door and I can't lay a finger on you." He took a single, precarious step toward her. "But I'm asking you. Please, don't go. I just need space to think, Sebastian. I'm suffocating." "You've had 15 months of space," he said it softly, the words devoid of any sharp edges. "And I've had 15 months of realizing exactly what I threw away. I'm not asking for your forgiveness today. I'm not even asking for your trust. But I am asking you not to make a decision out of pure, cold fear and call it independence. Don't you dare tell me what my motives are. Then tell me I'm wrong." He pinned her with a gaze that was raw and dangerously honest. "Tell me you don't feel what's been happening in that kitchen. Tell me there's nothing left between us, and I will personally walk you to that gate and watch you leave." Ava, sensing the tectonic shift in the air, reached out from the carrier. Her tiny, inquisitive hand found the rough stubble of Sebastian's jaw. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and pressed a lingering, instinctive kiss into the center of her small palm. Natalie watched the gesture, and the armor she'd been wearing for a year finally developed a hairline fracture. Something in her expression shattered, a visceral breaking that she tried and failed to hide. "Sebastian, I love you." He said it without the polish of a pitch or the desperation of a plea. "I loved you when I was a coward, and I loved you every agonizing day I spent looking for you. I don't know how to turn it off." He paused, his voice dropping to a hushed, reverent whisper. "And I love her. I haven't earned the right to say it, I know that. But she is my heart, Natalie. Our daughter is my heart." Her eyes flooded, the light from the runway shimmering in the unshed tears. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker. "Final boarding call for Flight 822 to Seattle." Natalie looked at the jet bridge. She looked back at him, the man who had once been her greatest source of pain and was now standing before her, stripped of every defense. The tears finally spilled over, silent and hot, I am so angry at you, she hissed, her voice trembling. I need you to understand that I am still furious. I know. This isn't a resolution. This isn't a happily ever after where everything is fixed. I'm scared and I'm angry, and I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again. I know. Stop saying I know to everything, she snapped, a fierce, jagged spark of her old self returning. A surprised, watery laugh broke from his chest. What do you want me to say, Nat? She stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Ava's hand was still resting against his jaw, a bridge of flesh and bone between their two worlds. I want you to say that you understand this is going to take time. Real, ugly, difficult time. Not movie time where we skip to the end. Her voice broke on the final word. And I need to know you won't run when the silence gets too loud again. I know it's going to take real time, he said, stepping into her space until they were breathing the same air. And I'm staying right here, I'm not running anymore. Behind them, the heavy mechanical thud of the gate door sounded. The jet bridge retracted. The flight to Seattle departed into a clear blue sky, leaving 3 people standing exactly where they belonged. They moved through the Orlando suburbs in a heavy, humid silence as the afternoon heat shimmered over the asphalt. Natalie had surrendered the keys, letting him drive her car back from the short-term parking lot, while Ava remained a silent, sleeping anchor in the back seat. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the blur of palm trees and stucco. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was too jagged for that, but it was finally honest. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand a performance, a quiet space that held the weight of their wreckage without forcing them to sort through the debris all at once. I need to tell you the rest, she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning when they were 10 minutes from the apartment. I'm listening. About the pregnancy, the NICU, the parts I've been keeping polished. She turned to look at him, her expression resolute and stripped of its usual armor. I've been giving you the edited highlights, the version where I'm the hero who handled it all. But if we're going to do this, if this is actually real, you need the raw footage. He nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. There was a night in the NICU, Natalie began, her voice steady with the kind of practiced effort that sounds like a glass about to crack. The doctors thought there was a complication, a cardiac murmur. It ended up being a false alarm, a shadow on a monitor that resolved itself. But for 6 agonizing hours, I lived in a world where my daughter's heart was failing. She paused, the memory of the antiseptic smell and the rhythmic beeping of the monitors flooding back until she could almost taste the salt of her own fear. I sat in a plastic chair next to her warming unit at 2 in the morning, and I called everyone. I called my mother. I called Priya. I even called a girl from my dorm I hadn't spoken to in 3 years just to hear a human voice. She finally pinned him with a look that was achingly direct. I didn't call you, Sebastian. He kept driving, his jaw set in a tight, pained line, the muscle leaping under his skin. It wasn't because I didn't want to. Her voice hitched, a single, jagged break before she forced it back into line. It was because I'd made a choice to survive without you, and I had to live in that choice, even on the worst night of my life. Even when every cell in my body wanted to call the only person who would truly understand what it felt like to lose a piece of their own soul. I would have come, he whispered, the words sounding like an open wound. I would have been there in hours. I know. She turned back to the window, watching her own reflection superimposed over the passing world. That's exactly why I couldn't call. The car rolled into the quiet, tree-lined street of her neighborhood. The orange trees were heavy with fruit, the scent of citrus, and damp earth drifting through the vents. I'm sorry, Sebastian said. He didn't say it like a social grace, he said it like a vow. I need you to hear that not as a word, but as a confession. I am sorry for every second you spent carrying a burden that should have had 2 sets of shoulders. For New York. For the silence. His voice was low, vibrating with a grim, newfound certainty. I can't rewrite the past, but I want to be the man who shows up for the next chapter. Properly. Without the mask. Natalie watched a stray leaf dance across the windshield. Priya asked me something before I booked that flight. She asked me what I actually wanted. Not what was safe, not what was logical. Just the truth. And what was the truth? She turned fully toward him now as he pulled the car to the curb and killed the engine. I told her I wanted the version of us that never got to exist, the one where you grew up before you walked out. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from the fabric of his sleeve. But that version is a fantasy, and I've spent these last 3 weeks trying to decide if I can want this version. The real one. The one that's covered in scars and bad timing and a year of resentment. Ava stirred in the back, making a small, dreaming sound before settling back into the deep sleep of the innocent. "Can you?" he asked, his voice thin with a desperate hope. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, and the way he sat. No longer the predator, but a man waiting for a sentence. She looked at him the way she used to, searching for the hidden parts of him that only she was allowed to see. "I don't trust you yet," she said, the honesty of it dropping between them like a stone. "I need that to be clear. I know. And we aren't picking up where we left off. That bridge is gone. We're starting somewhere new, somewhere slower. Whatever pace you set, I'm not going anywhere. You're going to mess up, Sebastian. You're going to get frustrated and I'm going to be afraid and we're going to have to actually talk, which is a language you're still learning. I've been practicing," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his tired face. I noticed. She reached back and unbuckled her seatbelt, the click echoing in the quiet cabin. Okay. It wasn't the okay of 15 months ago, the one that signaled the end. This was a different word entirely, warm and fragile, a door being pushed open just wide enough for the light to spill through. "Let's try." She stepped out into the humid afternoon air. Sebastian sat for a moment longer, alone in the driver's seat, closing his eyes and letting the sheer, terrifying weight of that second chance settle into his bones. Then he got out too. He moved to the back door, his movements careful and reverent as he unstrapped his daughter from her seat and followed Natalie toward the yellow walls of the only home he wanted to know. 6 months had passed and the Florida humidity had finally become a partner rather than an enemy. It was Sunday morning in the apartment, the same sun-drenched sanctuary with the yellow walls and the view of the orange tree. But the geography of the rooms had shifted. There were small, defiant markers of a shared life now. A second toothbrush leaning in the porcelain holder. A ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest CEO." A tongue-in-cheek find from a local farmer's market that Natalie had set on the counter one Tuesday without a word. He had never moved it. He treated that cheap mug like a holy relic. Ava, now 16 months old, had graduated from shaky steps to a total, unadulterated conviction in her own velocity. She had discovered running 6 weeks ago and had been navigating the hallway with the reckless, windswept joy of a captive who had finally tasted the open road. She was currently hurtling from the kitchen to the living room and back, her tiny feet slapping against the floor with a rhythmic, frantic energy for reasons known only to herself. Sebastian was at the stove attempting eggs. He was a profoundly mediocre cook, a fact they had both accepted with a strange, domestic grace. But he was there. He was specifically undeniably present, a man who had traded his boardroom armor for a grease-spattered apron. It had taken real work, the kind of work that involves jagged midnight conversations on the balcony and the slow, agonizing dismantling of old habits. But he had learned the language of staying. Natalie sat at the small table, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she navigated a consulting project. She was mid-sentence when Ava blurred past, catching the hem of Natalie's shirt in a fleeting, sticky grip, a brief, physical confirmation of, "You're here, I'm here," before disappearing toward the sofa. Natalie didn't look up, but a slow, soft smile bloomed on her face, radiating from the screen to the very corners of the room. Here is the secret they don't put in the movies. The real heroism isn't in the airport sprints or the rain-soaked confessions. The true labor is found in the quiet, mundane machinery of a Sunday morning. It's in the smell of slightly burned toast, the cluttered bathroom counter, and the tiny person with green eyes who runs in circles because she hasn't yet learned that the world expects her to trip. Choosing to stay when you know exactly how much it costs to leave. That is the only grand gesture that matters. Sebastian slid a plate onto the table in front of her and sank into the chair across from her. Ava skidded to a halt, gripped the edge of the mahogany table, and offered them both a look of absolute toothy satisfaction before launching herself back into the fray. Natalie closed her laptop, the click sounding like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She reached across the table, her hand open and vulnerable. Sebastian looked down at her palm for a heartbeat, his breath hitching as if he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to touch her. Then he turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers, his grip firm and grounded, a silent promise kept. Outside, the orange tree stood bathed in the golden, indifferent light of the morning. It wasn't doing anything spectacular. It was simply existing, rooted and blooming, which is its own kind of miracle if you've spent a lifetime drifting. Natalie leaned back, her hand still anchored in his, and realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that she had spent years running toward a horizon that didn't exist. She never imagined this. The burned eggs, the chaotic laughter, the quiet, shared breath, was what coming home actually felt like.